This is a story about a city, not a city you have probably visited, and not a city whose name still lives on the world map the way Paris or Cairo does. This city is a mound of packed earth and broken brick in southern Iraq, rising about 20 meters above a flat alluvial plain, roughly 160 kilometers southeast of modern Baghdad. Today the place is called Nippur. In the ancient world it was known as Nippur or Nippur in the spelling most people recognize. And beginning in 1888, what archaeologists uncovered there quietly changed the way we understand how civilization remembered itself. Before we go any further, take a second and drop a comment with where you are listening from tonight. Whatever time it is where you are, whether the room is already dark or just beginning to dim, someone else somewhere is hearing these same words in their own corner of the night. There is something strangely beautiful about that. Something that feels fitting for a story like this one. Now picture yourself inside the climate-controlled storage rooms of the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. The air is cool and carefully managed. The lighting is soft and even bright enough to see clearly, but flat enough to cast almost no shadows. Around you are rows of metal shelving lined with padded archival trays. Resting inside them are pieces of clay. Some are no larger than a palm. Others are broader, shaped like tablets, the color of pale sand or baked earth. Some are cracked through the middle. Some have missing corners. Some were repaired long ago with conservation adhesive, the seam still visible if you look closely enough. These objects were made 4,000 years ago. Some are older than that. Some may reach back 5,000 years or more. They are light in the hand, almost weightless compared with stone or metal. And yet in another sense, they may be the heaviest things in the entire building. Because if you were to pick one up and run your thumb gently across its surface, you would feel that the marks impressed into it are not decoration. They are not random patterns. They are writing. One of the earliest writing systems ever created. A script made of wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, then dried in the sun or baked hard enough to last for millennia. And those marks preserve something very specific. They preserve what someone in the ancient city of Nippur believed was important enough to record. What did they record? Among tens of thousands of entries, lists, hymns, stories, and official documents, they recorded a repeated idea. A claim that appears again and again in different forms. Nippur, they said, was not like other cities. It was never a political capital in the usual sense. No empire ruled from its throne. No great dynasty began there. No army marched under its banner to conquer the world. And yet kings from every major Mesopotamian power came there when they needed something more important than conquest. They came for legitimacy. From the earliest Sumerian city-states to the Akkadian Empire, from the Babylonians to the Kassites and Assyrians, rulers traveled to Nippur and stood before the temple there, not to destroy the city, but to be recognized by it. That is what makes Nippur so unusual. Scattered across its tablets are hymns, cosmic genealogies, administrative records, flood narratives, and formal lists of gods and their ranks. Across all of them runs the same core message. Not just that Nippur was sacred, but that it occupied a unique place in the structure of reality itself. The texts call it Duranki, the bond between heaven and earth. They say it was founded not by an ordinary human ruler, but by Enlil, the great god of wind and authority, the one credited with separating sky from earth at the beginning of the world. They say he chose this exact place on the Mesopotamian plain as the point where the connection between those two realms still remained. They say the Anunnaki, the great divine assembly of the Sumerian world, met there. They say the tablet of destinies was kept there. They say the fate of kings and kingdoms was decided there. They say that without this place, Nothing else worked the way it should. Now, on its own, that may sound like the kind of grand claim sacred cities often make. Many holy places across history have called themselves central, chosen, eternal, or uniquely blessed. But what makes Nippur different is not just the scale of the claim. It is the evidence behind it. Because this is not a single legend surviving in one late copy. It is not one poem or one priestly tradition. It is a mass of evidence on a staggering scale. Roughly 30,000 clay tablets. The accumulated archival output of a scribal culture that continued with remarkable continuity for around 3,000 years. Even more striking, more than 80% of all known Sumerian literary compositions were found at this one site. That is not a normal pattern of survival. That is concentration, preservation, intention. Something was being kept at Nippur. Something was copied and recopied across dynasties, across language shifts, across political collapse and cultural change. Even after Sumerian stopped being a spoken language, scribes still learned, it studied it, and continued preserving the old texts. The language survived as a learned tradition long after it vanished from everyday speech, much the way Latin survived in medieval scholarship. So, the question that hangs over this city is simple, but it is enormous. What were they trying so hard to preserve? And why did it matter so much that generations of scribes kept copying these texts long after the civilization that first created them had changed beyond recognition? To even begin answering that, we have to understand where Nippur stood, not just on a map, but in time. Southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is not the kind of place that looks destined to become the cradle of civilization. The land is broad, low, and almost unnervingly flat. There is very little stone, almost no timber, and no significant local metal ore. The ground is built from layers of river silt spread across ages by waterways that shifted course again and again. In summer, the heat is crushing. In winter, the cold can bite harder than many people expect. Rainfall is unreliable. Fertility depends on delicate control of water. And yet for all of that, this is where cities first emerged. Around 5000 BC, during what archaeologists call the Ubaid period, people began building permanent settlements across this difficult plain. Not temporary camps. Settlements with mud brick houses, storage facilities, communal structures, and the beginnings of organized administration. Over the next 2,000 years, those settlements would grow into something the world had never seen before. Cities. Among those early settlements was Nippur. According to the best archaeological evidence we have, occupation at Nippur began in the Ubaid period itself, around 5000 BC. That places its beginnings before writing, before the wheel, before bronze, before nearly every invention we tend to associate with civilization. The mound at modern Nippur is not one city frozen in time. It is many cities layered on top of one another, each generation building over the remains of the last. A stack of human lives compressed into earth. Across roughly 7,000 years of occupation, this one place was inhabited, abandoned, rebuilt, and remembered again. And that alone should make us pause, because most cities do not last like that. Even the greatest cities rise and fall with trade war rivers and empire. They move, they disappear, they get replaced. Nippur also declined. It was abandoned more than once, at times it lay empty for centuries. But people kept returning to it. They rebuilt on the same ground. They restored what had fallen. They started over where others had stopped. Why? The answer given again and again by the historical record is almost disarmingly simple. Because it was sacred. Because it was the city of Enlil. Because in Mesopotamian thought, kingship did not begin with men. It descended from heaven. And the place where that descent was recognized, formalized and made real in the human world, was Nippur. That political arrangement is one of the strangest and most revealing features of the ancient Mesopotamian world. For roughly 3,000 years, Nippur had no empire of its own. It did not dominate the region through military force. It did not impose tribute on rival cities through conquest. It did not produce a line of world-ruling kings. In a conventional political sense, it was weak. And yet, in a deeper sense, it held a form of authority that was harder to replace than armies. If a ruler wanted to be recognized as legitimate in southern Mesopotamia, he had to be connected to Nippur. He had to honor Enlil in the great temple there, the Ekur, and receive acknowledgement from the city's religious establishment. That mattered because in the Mesopotamian view, power was not truly secure unless it had divine sanction. A king could win battles, seize land, and build palaces, but unless his rule fit within the sacred order, centered at Nippur, it always remained incomplete. Sargon of Akkad understood this. So did the kings of Ur III. So did the Kassites centuries later. Even the Assyrians, who built their own theological and imperial system around the god Assur in the north, still found it worthwhile to restore temples at Nippur and honor Enlil there. That is not a small detail. It tells you just how deeply the city's authority was embedded in the fabric of Mesopotamian civilization. This is where Nippur begins to feel less like an ordinary sacred city and more like something structurally different. It was not simply holy, it was central in a procedural sense. It was part of how the system worked. And that same pattern appears in the archaeology. At the heart of Nippur stood the temple of Enlil called the Ekur. The name is usually translated as mountain house. In Sumerian, E means house or temple, and Kur means mountain. That name matters more than it might seem at first, because southern Mesopotamia is almost completely flat. There are no nearby mountains. The landscape stretches outward in level expanses of silt and sky. If you wanted a mountain there, you had to build one. That, in essence, is what a ziggurat was. The stepped temple tower, so iconic in Mesopotamian architecture, was not just an impressive building. It was an artificial mountain. In a landscape without natural heights, it created the vertical connection that mountains symbolized in many ancient cosmologies. Mountains rise from earth toward heaven. They stand at the meeting point between below and above. And in Nippur, the temple of Enlil was explicitly understood in those terms. Excavations at the Ekur revealed not just one temple, but a long sequence of rebuilding. Archaeologists identified 17 major building phases at the sacred complex, reaching back to around 3,200 BC. Again and again, when the structure decayed, it was rebuilt on the same footprint. Not a little farther down the mound. Not in a newly chosen sacred quarter. On the exact same ground. That repetition matters. When a society keeps rebuilding a temple in exactly the same place for centuries, then for millennia, it is telling you that location itself has meaning. The building is important, yes, but the site is even more important. The holiness is not transferable. It belongs to that patch of earth. And at Nippur, later rulers seem to have treated that continuity with extraordinary seriousness. During the Kassite revival of the city, after periods of abandonment and decline, incoming authorities appear to have either consulted old records in great detail or physically investigated buried foundations to reconstruct the sacred buildings where they had originally stood. In either case, they were not improvising, they were restoring. That distinction is crucial. They were not creating a new sacred center. They were recovering an old one. Which brings us back to the tablets. The great turning point in modern understanding of Nippur began in 1888 when an expedition funded by the University of Pennsylvania arrived at the mound of Nippur. The team was led by John P. Peters, a clergyman and scholar with a strong interest in the biblical world and the ancient Near East. Among the expedition's most important members was John Henry Haynes, who would spend years at the site, and Herman Hilprecht, an Assyriologist who studied the inscriptions and later became famous and controversial for his interpretations of what had been found. At the time, American archaeology in Mesopotamia was still new. British and French excavators had already been active in the region for decades. The Pennsylvania expedition wanted to make a major discovery of its own. It did. The mound they faced was enormous, roughly a kilometer across, with several rising sections. One of the highest points marked the Great Ziggurat Mound. Elsewhere, the site looked like a landscape of broken ridges and wind-shaped debris, its outlines blurred by time. Local dealers had already brought some tablets from the area to wider attention, so scholars knew the site mattered. But no one seems to have expected what the excavation would reveal. In 4 excavation seasons between 1888 and 1900, the expedition recovered more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments from Nippur. That number is almost hard to feel properly. It sounds impressive, but the scale of what it means only becomes clear when you compare it to what had existed before. Prior to the finds at Nippur, the known body of Sumerian literature was tiny, just a scattered handful of texts in museum collections. Nippur changed that almost overnight. It multiplied the known literary record by orders of magnitude. And these tablets were not all the same kind of text. Far from it. Some were administrative records, grain accounts, labor lists, receipts, inventories, temple distributions, offerings, contracts, court decisions, letters between officials, school exercises written by students learning to copy difficult signs, lexical lists organizing words by category, bilingual dictionaries pairing Sumerian and Akkadian terms, mathematical texts, medical instructions, ritual directions, astronomical observations. But alongside all of that practical material were literary works of astonishing range and sophistication. There were hymns to gods and temples, myths of beginnings, flood stories, love poetry, wisdom literature, laments, narratives about kings, compositions that would echo into later Mesopotamian and even biblical traditions. Among the finds were early forms of stories connected to Gilgamesh, as well as a Sumerian flood narrative that preserved memories of divine judgment, survival, and renewed kingship, long before similar stories became familiar through other sources. At first, Hilprecht believed he had found something like a temple library, especially because literary tablets seemed heavily concentrated in some areas. Later scholarship complicated that picture. It became clear that the literary material was spread more widely across the site, and that Nippur's scribal culture was not confined to one single library room or archive chamber. It was citywide, institutional, embedded in education, religion, and administration. In other words, this was not just a storage accident. It was a tradition. Many literary texts survived in multiple copies from different periods, which tells us something incredibly important. These compositions were not simply written once and then forgotten in a back room. They were actively recopied, taught, preserved, reintroduced to new generations of scribes. There was a conscious effort to keep them alive. That effort becomes even more striking when you realize how unusually concentrated the literary record is at this one site. Nippur does not merely contribute to Sumerian literature, it dominates the surviving record. More than 80% of known Sumerian literary compositions are represented there. No other site compares. Not Babylon with all its prestige, not not Uruk, not Eridu. Luck alone cannot explain that. Preservation conditions matter, of course. Excavation history matters too. But the concentration is too dramatic to ignore. Something about Nippur made it the place where texts were copied, stored, and carried forward. And once you notice that a larger pattern begins to emerge, the city that had no kings of its own became the city that guarded the memory of kingship. The city that commanded no army became the city that preserved the literature of civilization. The city that called itself the bond between heaven and earth became the city where the written record of that claim was kept most faithfully. So the question grows sharper. If Nippur was not the political capital of Mesopotamia, why did it become the archival capital of its deepest memory? That is where the story takes a more unsettling turn, because the answer the tablets keep circling is the same one the city had always made about itself. Nippur was where heaven touched the world. To understand why the scribes of Nippur kept returning to that idea, we need to look at one of the most important lines in all of Sumerian literature. It appears at the beginning of the Sumerian king list, a text that survives in several versions, including the famous Weld Blundell prism. The line is simple, direct, almost unnervingly matter-of-fact. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That sentence is easy to glide past, but if you stop and really sit with it, it becomes extraordinary. It does not say that kingship gradually emerged out of social complexity. It does not say people organized themselves, chose leaders, and slowly developed political institutions. It says kingship descended. It came down. In the Sumerian way of thinking, that was not just poetic language. Heaven was understood as a real realm inhabited by specific divine beings with real authority. Kingship was treated as an institution that originated there and was transferred downward into human society. The king list then names a series of cities that held kingship in succession. First Eridu, then others before and after the flood. The earliest reigns are impossibly long, tens of thousands of years, which has led modern scholars to read the list as a mixture of theology, symbolic chronology, and dynastic memory. And that is a reasonable interpretation. But one detail is especially important for our story. Nippur is not listed as one of the cities that held kingship. That absence is not accidental. In fact, it may be one of the clearest clues to what Nippur actually was. The king list is about political rule. It names the cities where kingship resided in a formal political sense. Nippur does not appear because Nippur did not compete for kingship in that way. It did not produce the kings who ruled Mesopotamia, and yet Nippur is exactly where kings went when they needed their rule confirmed. So kingship descended from heaven, but it was ratified at Nippur. That is a remarkable distinction. Nippur was not the seat of kingship. It was the seat of legitimacy. This begins to explain why the city mattered so much. It stood slightly outside the normal struggle for power, which made it uniquely suitable as the place where power could be recognized. A king could conquer Kish Uruk or Akkad. He could seize territory and call himself mighty. But to be accepted as part of the cosmic order, he still had to pass through the sacred structure anchored at Nippur. And that sacred structure was built around Enlil. In much of Mesopotamian history, Enlil was not just another god among many. He was the chief authority of the divine world, the lord of command, wind order, and decreed fate. If kingship descended from heaven, Enlil was one of the great powers through whom that descent became meaningful on earth. His temple at Nippur, the Ekur, was not merely one shrine among others. It was presented as a kind of central node in the whole system. This is where the flood text from Nippur becomes important. One of the most famous tablets from the site, often referred to as the Eridu Genesis, preserves part of a very old Sumerian story involving the creation of humanity, the founding of the first cities, and the flood. The surviving text is damaged, but enough remains to show how closely the Sumerians connected these themes. Human beings, city foundations, divine order, and catastrophe are all part of one continuous framework. That matters because it tells us something about how the Sumerians thought civilization began. In the modern world, we usually imagine civilization as a gradual human achievement. Villages grow larger, agriculture becomes more efficient, administration becomes more complex, writing appears, law emerges, cities develop. But the Sumerian texts often describe it differently. They describe civilization as something transmitted. Cities are founded with divine involvement. Kingship descends from heaven. The ordering principles of society are given to humanity rather than invented by it. Even if we read those claims symbolically, the pattern is unmistakable. The Sumerians consistently thought of the structure of civilization as an inheritance, not just a human creation, and Nippur seems to have seen itself as the place where that inheritance was managed. This is what makes this city so fascinating. The texts do not present it merely as a location where people worshipped the heavens. They present it as the point where the administration of reality touched the human world, not metaphorically in a loose sense, but operationally. That is the tone the texts often use. This becomes even clearer when we look again at the name Duranki. The phrase is usually translated as bond of heaven and earth. It can also carry the sense of link tie or connecting point. In other words, not just a symbolic relationship, but a joining mechanism, something that holds two realms together. That was one of the designations associated with Nippur and its sacred precinct. If you were a Sumerian scribe, trained in the city's literary and religious traditions, this would not have sounded like decorative language. It would have sounded like a statement about function. Nippur was where the upper and lower worlds remained connected. It was the place through which authority, order, and destiny moved. This is one reason the city's repeated rebuilding becomes so revealing. If Nippur had simply been a once important holy place, its prestige might have faded as dynasties rose and fell. But if it was thought of as the bond between realms, then abandoning it permanently would have meant more than neglecting a shrine. It would have meant neglecting the connection itself. And the people of Mesopotamia never quite did that. Even when the city declined, they returned. Even when its buildings crumbled, they rebuilt. Even when the language of the old hymns died in daily speech, they preserved the language so the text could still be read. That level of continuity is hard to dismiss as ordinary conservatism. It suggests that the people maintaining Nippur's traditions believed they were preserving something foundational. There is another piece of evidence that adds weight to this picture. Old Babylonian literary catalogs found at Nippur show that scribes maintained organized lists of compositions by their opening lines. These were not random heaps of old tablets. They were curated collections, inventoried, ordered, taught. That tells us the preservation of Sumerian literature was not passive. It was an institutional project. Someone decided which texts mattered enough to copy. Someone trained students in them. Someone organized them as part of a living curriculum. And again, the texts that mattered most seemed to circle back to the same themes. Enlil, Nippur, cosmic authority, the descent of kingship, the structure of divine rule, the bond between heaven and earth. So, when modern readers ask whether the Sumerians were writing myth or memory, the answer is not as simple as choosing one or the other. From a scholarly perspective, these texts are certainly mythic in form. They belong to religion, cosmology, and sacred literature. But from the perspective of the scribes who preserved them, they were not empty stories. They were records of how reality was structured. That difference matters. Because once you realize that Nippur starts to look less like a religious center in the casual sense and more like an archive of civilization's operating assumptions, it preserved not just stories about gods, but a worldview in which law-time kingship and urban life all depended on a sacred order descending from above and centered at one city on the Mesopotamian plain. And if that was the worldview being preserved there, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly was housed in the Ekur, the great mountain house of Enlil that made Nippur the place where destiny itself was said to be decided? The temple of Enlil at Nippur was called the Ekur, the mountain house. And that name was not ornamental. It told you exactly what the temple was believed to be. In a flat country where the horizon runs almost unbroken in every direction, a mountain is not just a landform. It is a meeting point. It rises out of earth toward heaven. It creates a vertical axis in a world that otherwise feels horizontal and endless. Southern Mesopotamia did not have that kind of natural geography, so the Sumerians built it. That is what the ziggurat was, not simply a monument, and not just a platform for a temple, but an artificial mountain, a constructed height, a statement in brick that the space between sky and ground could be marked, ordered, and maintained. And in the hymns to Enlil and Nippur, that is exactly how the Ekur is described. One of the best-known compositions, often called Enlil in the Ekur, speaks of Nippur as the lofty bond between heaven and earth, and describes the temple as the place where Enlil took his seat. The language is elevated, of course. It is sacred literature. But it is also strikingly precise in what it keeps repeating. Nippur is not merely beloved. It is central. The Ekur is not merely beautiful. It is functional. The place matters because something happens there that cannot happen anywhere else. The hymn says that Enlil founded Nippur in the middle of the four quarters of the earth. That phrase, middle of the four quarters, is one of the most revealing in the whole tradition. It means center, not just spiritually important, but positioned as the axis from which the world is organized. That kind of language can be read symbolically, and many scholars do read it that way. Sacred poetry in every culture uses cosmic language to elevate holy places. That is true. But even when you keep that caution in mind, something about the Nippur material still feels unusually systematic. The city is called the center, the bond, the place where fate is determined, the place where kingship is confirmed, the place where the gods assemble. These are not random complements. They fit together like parts of a structure, and the Ekur sits right in the middle of that structure. The temple's importance also shows up in the practical habits of kings. When Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, began consolidating power around 2100 BC, one of his earliest priorities was rebuilding the Ekur. That is revealing. A ruler trying to establish durable authority did not begin only with roads, fortifications, or royal residences. He began with Nippur, with Enlil, with the temple that made kingship legible inside the sacred order. That pattern repeats across centuries. Different dynasties, different ethnic groups, different political conditions. Same instinct. Restore Nippur, honor the Ekur, secure legitimacy. And all of this brings us back to one of the most important terms in the city's tradition, Duranki. The phrase is made up of three elements. Dur, meaning bond, tie, or link, and meaning heaven or sky. Kai, meaning earth or ground. Put them together and you get the bond between heaven and earth, the tie that holds the upper and lower realms together. That was not just an abstract idea floating in literature. It referred to a real sacred area in Nippur, associated with the Ekur and the divine authority of Enlil. In multiple texts, Duranki appears as the place where Enlil's rule is centered, where cosmic order is anchored, and where the connection between divine and human realms is maintained. To appreciate how significant that is, it helps to understand how the Sumerians imagined the universe. In Sumerian cosmology, heaven and earth were once joined. Creation involved separation. Enlil, in many traditions, is the force who separated sky from ground and made the habitable world possible. Life as we know it existed because that separation occurred. But the texts also suggest that the separation was not complete in every sense. Somewhere one point remained where the relationship between the two realms was still active. That point was Nippur. Now that can be understood in at least two ways. The first is the cautious scholarly reading. Nippur was called the bond between heaven and earth because it was the supreme religious center of a civilization that described sacred importance using cosmic language. In that view, Duranki is an honorific title, a theological statement of centrality rather than a literal description of an actual connection. The second reading takes the text a little more seriously on their own terms. In that view, the Sumerians genuinely believed Nippur occupied a unique cosmographic position. The rites performed there were not only symbolic expressions of devotion, they were acts of maintenance, things you had to do because the system depended on them. Whichever reading you prefer, one fact remains hard to ignore. The people of Mesopotamia behaved as if the claim mattered. They rebuilt the city. They preserved the hymns. They kept the rituals. They maintained the scribal schools. They made kings come there. The language of Duranki was not treated like decorative poetry. It was treated like institutional reality. And that leads us naturally to the beings said to assemble there, the Anunnaki. Few words from ancient Mesopotamia have been more overloaded in the modern imagination. They have been turned into aliens, lost superhumans, fallen angels, and every kind of speculative figure you can imagine. But in the actual Sumerian and Akkadian texts, the Anunnaki are something at once simpler and more interesting. They are a divine council, not one god, but a collective. A group of high-ranking deities associated with cosmic governance, fate, and the ordering of the world. Their significance is clearest when they are described in relation to Enlil. The texts place them before him, around him, acting within the framework of his authority. In some traditions, their number is given as 50, a number that carried associations of completeness and full divine power in Mesopotamian thought. That number matters because Enlil himself is strongly associated with it. 50 is not just arithmetic here. It is symbolic of total authority of the fully constituted divine assembly. And where did this assembly meet? Again and again, the answer points back to Nippur. The hymns place the Anunnaki in the Duranki before Enlil's throne. Later, God lists and theological compilations preserve the same hierarchy. The pattern is consistent. If there was a seat of divine governance in the Sumerian world, it was not imagined in some unreachable sky alone. It had an earthly reference point, a place where the order of heaven and the administration of the human world intersected. Nippur. This is one of the reasons the city mattered so much in politics. Mesopotamian kingship was never purely personal. A king was not just a strong man with an army. He was meant to fit into a cosmic structure. The divine assembly decreed fate. Enlil confirmed authority. Nippur served as the earthly place where that process became visible. That also helps explain why the city could remain so powerful without being politically dominant. It did not need to rule directly. It occupied the place from which ruling itself was made meaningful. And if the Ekur was the mountain house where heaven and earth met, and if Duranki was the bond holding those realms together, and if the Anunnaki assembled there to determine fates, then the next piece falls into place almost naturally. Nippur was not only where authority was acknowledged, it was where destiny itself was said to be kept. Among all the things the texts associate with Nippur, one stands out for its strange precision. It is called the Tablet of Destinies. In Sumerian tradition and later in Akkadian literature as well, this is not described as a vague symbol or a poetic image. It is treated as an actual object, a tablet, something held guarded, seized, recovered, and the power attached to it is extraordinary. Whoever possesses it does not merely hold prestige. Whoever possesses it holds the authority by which the world is ordered. That is what makes the Tablet of Destinies so different from an ordinary royal emblem. A crown marks who the king is. A scepter signals power. A throne displays status. But the Tablet of Destinies does something more. In the text, it does not just represent sovereignty. It seems to operate it. It is bound up with the actual determination of fate, with the functioning of cosmic order itself. And where is this object associated again and again? With Enlil, with the divine assembly, with Nippur. One of the most dramatic accounts appears in the myth often called Anzu, the story of the great bird creature who steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil's presence. The setup is almost startling in its simplicity. Enlil has set the tablet aside. In that moment of vulnerability, Anzu takes it and escapes. The consequence is immediate disorder. The texts describe the shrine's falling silent divine order, interrupted destiny itself, thrown off balance. This is not presented as a mere palace theft. It is not like stealing a badge of office from a sleeping king. When the Tablet of Destinies is removed, the machinery of the cosmos falters. That detail matters, because if the tablet were only a ceremonial object, its theft would transfer legitimacy or provoke political crisis. Instead, it halts function. The universe does not just lose the right ruler, it loses a vital operating instrument. Eventually in the myth, the tablet is recovered and returned, and order is restored. Most scholars read this the way one would expect. The Tablet of Destinies is understood as a theological symbol of cosmic sovereignty, a narrative way of expressing who has rightful authority over the universe. That interpretation is elegant, and it makes sense. It fits the way ancient myth often turns abstractions into tangible objects. But the object is still unusual because the texts do not describe it only as a symbol of authority. They describe it as the mechanism through which authority functions. That is a more technical idea than myth normally requires. It suggests something like a record, a decree, set a binding framework, a governing instrument. Not just a sign of rule, but an instrument of administration. And once again, Nippur is where that instrument belongs. This is exactly the kind of detail that makes the city's tradition so difficult to dismiss as simple, poetic inflation. The claim is not merely that Nippur was sacred. It is that Nippur housed the thing by which fate was managed. Now, whether we take that literally symbolically or somewhere in between is another matter. But the scribes who preserve these traditions seem to have treated the claim as meaningful in a very concrete way. That becomes even clearer when we move from myth into temple literature. Around 2300 BC, a woman named Enheduanna composed a cycle of temple hymns that survive as some of the earliest known authored literature in human history. That alone would make her unforgettable. As far as we can presently tell, she is the earliest writer in the world whose name we know. Enheduanna was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, and she served as high priestess of the moon god at Ur. Her temple hymns are not random devotional verses. They are a carefully structured literary map of the sacred landscape of Sumer and Akkad. Each poem addresses a specific temple in a specific city and describes its divine inhabitant and cosmic role. That makes them incredibly valuable for understanding how Mesopotamians themselves imagined the religious geography of their world. And when Enheduanna turns to Nippur, the language becomes unmistakably direct. She describes the shrine there as the place where destiny is determined, not a place where people pray about destiny, not a place where destiny is symbolized, the place where destiny is determined. She also describes the Ekur in mountain language, speaking of its elevated architectural features, as if the building itself were a sacred height. Again, this is not casual description. It is a reminder that the temple is understood as the constructed mountain at the center of the world order. And the order of her hymns matters too. She begins with Eridu, the city associated in tradition with the first descent of kingship. Then she moves to Nippur. That sequence is not random. Eridu comes first in primordial order. Nippur comes next because Nippur is where that order is stabilized, administered, and transmitted. In other words, Enheduanna does not treat Nippur as just another shrine in a sacred network. She treats it as a place with a special role in how the whole network holds together. This is one reason the city became such a magnet for preservation. If you believe Nippur was where destiny was determined, where Enlil ruled, where the Anunnaki assembled, and where the Tablet of Destinies properly belonged, then preserving the texts of Nippur was not just a literary exercise. It was the maintenance of the world's memory of how order worked. That helps explain something that otherwise seems almost excessive. Why did generations of scribes continue copying these materials even after Sumerian had become a dead language in daily life? Why did later dynasties keep investing in Nippur's archives and schools? Why did foreign rulers adopt its traditions instead of letting them fade? Because from inside the tradition, these were not merely old stories. They were operating documents of civilization's sacred framework. You can see that same mentality reflected in the way temple law, kingship, and literature intersect at Nippur. None of them are separate categories in the modern sense. They overlap because reality itself was imagined as layered and interconnected. Political rule was sacred. Sacred rule required legitimation. Legitimation depended on divine order. Divine order was tied to place. And that place was Nippur. At this point, the city starts to feel less like a location and more like a junction. A junction where myth, ritual, law, memory, and governance all meet. And the more you look at the evidence, the harder it becomes to believe that the concentration of text there was accidental. These were not simply literary treasures buried by chance. They formed part of an enduring project of cultural transmission. Someone for centuries upon centuries believed that if the core traditions of civilization were going to survive, they had to survive through Nippur. That is the larger significance of the Tablet of Destinies, whether one reads it literally or symbolically. It represents the idea that order can be held transmitted and protected. And in the Sumerian imagination, Nippur was the earthly place where that holding happened. So, when we ask what the scribes were preserving, one answer keeps returning. They were preserving the claim that civilization itself had a center, not merely a political capital, and not merely a rich city, but a governing center. A place where destiny, law, kingship, and sacred order converged, which is why the next piece of evidence matters so much. Because at Nippur, they did not only preserve texts about the center of the world, at one point they drew a map of it. Near the end of the 19th century, among the many objects excavated from Nippur, archaeologists found something that feels almost startlingly modern. It was a map. Today, it is known by its museum catalog number CBS 13885, and it is one of the most remarkable artifacts from the site. On a clay tablet no larger than a hand, an ancient scribe scratched out a plan of the city. Not a poetic description, not a hymn, not a myth. A map. A spatial rendering of Nippur itself. At first glance, that might not sound extraordinary. Cities map themselves. Administrative cultures record walls, canals, gates, districts, and sacred areas. But this particular map becomes extraordinary when you consider when it was made and what it was used for. The tablet dates to the Kassite period, roughly around 1500 BC. By then, Nippur had already passed through cycles of growth, decline, destruction, and rebuilding. At certain points, parts of the city had been abandoned, canals had shifted, structures had collapsed, sand and time had buried older layers. Yet the map preserves the layout of the sacred and urban landscape with enough accuracy that modern archaeologists were later able to compare it to excavation results and confirm that its major features corresponded to the actual city beneath the mound. It shows the Ekur temple complex. It marks the canal that ran through the city. It lays out walls, gates, and surrounding water features. It identifies key sections of the urban plan with labels and measurements. It is not perfect in the way a modern survey map would be perfect, but that is not the point. The point is that it works. And once you realize that a new question appears, how did the Kassite scribes know enough to make such a map of a city that had already passed through periods of ruin and disruption? The most cautious answer is also the most likely. They had records, older administrative texts, temple documents, surveys, written descriptions, maybe direct knowledge preserved through local continuity, maybe even careful investigation of surviving ruins and buried foundations. That is how most scholars understand it, and it makes sense. But even that practical explanation contains something remarkable. If the Kassites could rebuild Nippur accurately using preserved records, then those records were not being treated merely as literature or old religious heritage. They were being treated as technical memory, as instructions, as operational documentation. That changes the feel of the archive. It means the tablets of Nippur were not only preserving stories about the city's sacred importance, they were also preserving the practical capacity to restore the city physically. The tradition did not just remember Nippur, it knew how to reassemble it. That distinction matters because it tells us the scribal culture at Nippur was not passive. It was active, procedural, and deeply institutional. The texts were not there simply to be admired. They were there to be used. And that brings us to one of the most extraordinary parts of Nippur's long afterlife. The Kassites were not Sumerians. They were not even native Akkadian speakers in origin. They came into Babylonia from outside, probably from the Zagros region, and established a dynasty that ruled for centuries. In ethnic and linguistic terms, they were outsiders to the ancient Sumerian world. Yet once they took power, they invested heavily in preserving Sumerian tradition at Nippur. That is one of the strangest and most revealing facts in the whole history of the city. By the Kassite period, Sumerian was no longer a spoken language in everyday life. It had already become what scholars call a learned language, used in ritual scholarship and elite scribal education. In that respect, it functioned a little like Latin in medieval Europe. No longer native speech, but still a carrier of prestige, knowledge, authority, and sacred continuity. The Kassites could easily have allowed that tradition to wither. Dynasties throughout history often replace earlier cultural systems with their own. They build new centers, promote new languages, shift rituals to fit new political needs. But that is not what happened at Nippur. Instead, the Kassites preserved the city's scribal traditions. They copied Sumerian literary texts. They trained scribes in old grammatical forms. They restored temples in ancient styles. They upheld the city's role as a sacred center, even though it belonged to a cultural system older than their own. Why? The easiest answer is political usefulness. Nippur conferred legitimacy. A foreign dynasty ruling Babylonia benefited from associating itself with the city where kingship was sanctified. That is surely part of the explanation, but it does not seem to be the whole explanation, because what they preserved was not only ceremony, they preserved curriculum, archive language, canonical literature. They maintained a living relationship to the city's textual memory. That is a deeper commitment than simple political theater usually requires. And this is where the literary catalogs found at Nippur become so important. Some of these tablets list compositions by their opening lines, essentially functioning as catalog records for a scribal curriculum. This tells us that the preservation of tradition there was systematic, not casual, not a matter of a few old tablets lying around. There was structure, selection, order, repetition, institutional intent. The city had become, in a real sense, the memory palace of Mesopotamian civilization. That phrase is not meant romantically. It is almost literal. If you wanted the deep textual memory of Sumerian culture, you went through Nippur. If you wanted the sacred literature that explained how kingship law, divine order, and cosmic centrality fit together, you found it there. And if you wanted legitimacy in the present, you anchored yourself to that preserved past. This helps explain why more than 80% of known Sumerian literary compositions come from Nippur. The city was not only preserving its own local traditions, it was functioning as a central repository for the civilization's literary heritage. And the more you think about that, the more powerful the image becomes. A city that never ruled the world militarily became the city that stored the world's oldest surviving intellectual archive. A city with no imperial throne became the city where later empires came to connect themselves to the source of order. A city that repeatedly collapsed and was rebuilt still retained enough authority that foreign dynasties treated its buried remains as worthy of recovery study and restoration. That is not normal urban history. It is closer to civilizational memory management. And Nippur continued to matter even after the great Sumerian age was long gone. Under the Persians, centuries later, the city was still functioning as an institutional center. One of the best examples comes from the Murashu archive, a group of business and financial records from a family operating in Nippur during the 5th century BC under Achaemenid rule. By then, the world had changed beyond anything the earliest builders of Nippur could have imagined. New empires, new political structures, new dominant languages. And yet Nippur still mattered enough to host major commercial, legal, and administrative activity. The city had outlived the Sumerians, the Akkadians Ur-3, the Old Babylonians, the Kassites, the Assyrians, and the Neo-Babylonians. It remained active into the Persian imperial age. That kind of duration demands explanation. And the explanation offered by the city's own texts never really changes. Nippur mattered because it was where the bond between heaven and earth was maintained. You can read that sentence as theology. You can read it as political ideology. You can read it as sacred metaphor. But whatever interpretation you choose, the historical behavior around Nippur shows that people across many centuries acted as though the claim had real force. They preserved the city. They preserved the texts. They preserved the language needed to read the texts. They preserved the map. They preserved the knowledge of how to rebuild the holy center, which means the real mystery is not whether Nippur was important. That is beyond doubt. The mystery is what exactly they believed would be lost if they allowed it to disappear. And that question becomes even sharper when we realize that the city did not just shape sacred tradition. It also shaped something far more practical and in some ways even more powerful. It shaped time itself. There is another dimension of Nippur's authority that is easier to miss because it sounds so ordinary at first. It is not a myth, not a hymn, not a dramatic story about God's floods or divine tablets. It is the calendar, and in some ways that makes it even more revealing. Every civilization that grows beyond the smallest agricultural communities has to solve the same problem. It has to organize time. You need to know when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for floods, when to collect offerings, when to schedule labor, when to mark contracts, and when to hold rituals. If you cannot coordinate time, you cannot coordinate society. In ancient Mesopotamia, that coordination was based primarily on the moon. Months followed the lunar cycle, and years were structured around the recurring rhythms of agriculture, temple life, and administration. But in the early periods, different cities used different calendars. They had different month names, different local festival rhythms, and slightly different systems for marking the year. That worked well enough when city-states operated more independently. It became much harder once larger political systems emerged. Empires need standardization. If officials in one city are dating contracts differently from officials in another, if temple obligations are reckoned on different cycles, if administrative records do not line up, then complexity becomes chaos very quickly. So at a certain point, Mesopotamia began standardizing time. And the calendar that became the standard was the calendar of Nippur. That detail is easy to underestimate, but it is massive in its implications. Once the Nippur calendar became the administrative norm, cities across Mesopotamia were no longer just acknowledging Nippur's sacred prestige. They were structuring daily life through its temporal system. Every contract, every official text, every dated record. Every year reckoned through that framework was in a quiet but very real way operating inside Nippur's order. Think about how powerful that is. You can conquer a city and still end up using its way of measuring time. You can build your own empire and still find yourself dating documents through a system tied to another city's sacred cycle. That is a different kind of authority, less dramatic than military conquest, but in some ways more enduring. Because infrastructure outlasts armies. The month names of the Nippur calendar were not empty labels. They were bound to the ritual and agricultural life of the city's temples. The first month carried associations with enthronement and sanctuary. Other months reflected agricultural work festival cycles and sacred observances linked to Nippur's divine order. So, when the wider Mesopotamian world adopted that calendar, it was not simply adopting a neutral counting device. It was adopting a time structure rooted in Nippur's ritual geography. That matters because in ancient thought, calendars were never just practical tools. They were sacred frameworks. Time was not imagined as a blank grid that humans arbitrarily filled with activity. It was shaped by celestial rhythms, divine order, seasonal transitions, and ritual obligations. To live by a calendar was to live inside a cosmic pattern. And if that pattern was anchored to Nippur, then Nippur's authority extended far beyond its walls. It extended into the way people experience the year itself. This is exactly the sort of thing that makes the city's role feel less symbolic and more operational. Nippur did not simply claim to stand at the center of the world. It helped define the structure through which the world was organized. The texts and later scholarly tradition connect this especially to Enlil. As Lord of Order, Atmosphere, and Authority, Enlil was naturally associated with the regulation of time. In that sense, the standardization of the calendar around Nippur makes perfect cultural sense. If Nippur was the place where divine governance touched the human realm, then of course it would also become the place from which the official year was reckoned. And once again, the pattern repeats. The city where kings received legitimacy also became the city whose calendar structured administration. The city where destiny was said to be determined also became the city whose months governed official time. The city called the bond between heaven and earth became the city through which celestial order was translated into practical human organization. This is the kind of evidence that does not prove a mystical claim, of course. It does something subtler. It shows how deeply the claim penetrated lived reality. Nippur's authority was not locked away in hymns. It was built into systems people used every day. That same pattern appears again when we move from time to law. Because if the calendar tells us how people reckoned the year, the law tells us how they ordered society, And once again, when we follow that thread back far enough, we find ourselves standing in Nippur. One of the major breakthroughs in understanding Mesopotamian law came in the 20th century, when scholars identified a legal text from Nippur as part of the Code of Ur-Nammu. This is widely recognized as the oldest surviving law code in human history, older than the far more famous Code of Hammurabi by roughly 3 centuries. That alone is enough to make it important. But what matters for our story is not only the age of the code, it is the way authority is framed in its opening. Like later Mesopotamian law codes, the prologue does not present law as something the king invented out of personal wisdom. The king is not saying these are my laws because I am strong enough to impose them. Instead, law descends through a chain of divine legitimacy. The gods authorize the ruler. The ruler establishes justice in the land, and standing inside that divine framework always is Enlil. This is a recurring pattern across Mesopotamian legal tradition. The right to legislate is not merely royal. It is derived. It comes from above. It is tied to divine sanction. And because Enlil is so central to that sanction, Nippur becomes central to the underlying logic of law itself. That is an extraordinary thing to realize. The same city that anchored sacred kingship also helped anchor legal order. The same city whose temple was called the Mountain House also stood behind the authority that made laws binding. The same city where the Tablet of Destinies belonged also became associated with the right ordering of human society. In modern terms, we tend to separate religion, law, administration, and cosmology into different categories. Ancient Mesopotamia did not. They were woven together. Law was not merely practical, it was part of the cosmic structure. Justice was not only social balance, it was alignment with divine order. And that order again and again led back to Nippur. This is where another Sumerian concept becomes important, the concept of the me. The emi were not simply skills or ideas. They were more like civilizational powers or ordered capacities. They included kingship law, priesthood, craft knowledge, ritual, offices, music governance, and many other things that make organized human life possible. In Sumerian thought, these were not invented from nothing by human beings. They were transmitted, given, distributed. That way of thinking matches the broader pattern we have already seen. The Sumerians consistently describe civilization not as an autonomous human creation, but as an inheritance shaped by divine order. And Nippur sits right near the center of that inheritance. If Eridu is often associated with the earliest descent of civilization's gifts, Nippur becomes the place where those gifts are ordered, legitimated, and held within a functioning system. It is where the powers of civilization are stabilized into governance, which means that by the time we bring together the calendar, the law codes, the temple literature, the preservation of the scribal archives, and the city's role in royal legitimacy, a clear image begins to form. Nippur was not only sacred in a devotional sense, it was administrative in a cosmic sense. It was the city where the ancient Mesopotamian world located the machinery of order. And whether we interpret that as theology, political philosophy, institutional memory, or some mixture of all three, the result is the same. Nippur became the place where people believed the framework of civilization itself was maintained. So the deeper we go, the stranger the pattern becomes. A city with no great dynasty of its own shaped kingship. A city with no empire of its own shaped law. A city with no army of its own shaped time. And all of it was recorded, copied, and protected on clay by scribes who seemed determined to make sure the memory of that structure would not vanish. Which brings us to the heart of the question. If Nippur was the place where so much of civilization's order was said to converge, what exactly were the scribes trying to preserve when they kept copying these texts across thousands of years? By this point, the pattern is difficult to ignore. Nippur was the city where kings sought legitimacy. It was the city whose temple stood at the center of the divine order. It was the city associated with the assembly of the Anunnaki, with the Tablet of Destinies, with the calendar, that structured Mesopotamian time, and with the sacred framework behind law itself. It was the city where more of Sumer's literary memory survived than anywhere else. So, when we ask what the scribes were preserving, we are not asking about a random archive of old texts. We are asking about a sustained attempt to carry forward a very specific vision of reality. And that vision seems to say, again and again, that civilization has an origin beyond ordinary human politics. That is one of the most striking features of the Sumerian tradition. The Sumerians do not usually describe themselves as inventors in the modern sense. They do not present writing kingship law, urban order, and sacred institutions as things they proudly made from scratch through their own ingenuity. Instead, the texts repeatedly describe these things as gifts, transmissions, inheritances, or decreed structures. They were received. This is where the concept of the me becomes so important. The me were the ordered powers of civilization. Not just tools or clever ideas, but the structured capacities that make human society possible. Kingship, priesthood, justice, craftsmanship, ritual knowledge, music, governance, social roles, writing, the proper arrangement of institutions. These were understood as real powers belonging first to the divine realm and only later distributed into the human world. That is a profound way of imagining civilization. In a modern framework, we tend to explain social development as the result of experimentation adaptation and accumulated human knowledge. In the Sumerian framework, the deepest structures of civilization already existed in a higher order. Human beings did not create them so much as receive and maintain them. That does not mean the Sumerians were naive or incapable of practical thought. On the contrary, their cities produced some of the most sophisticated administrative systems of the ancient world. They knew perfectly well how irrigation worked, how trade functioned, how labor had to be organized. But when they reflected on the ultimate origin of civilization, they placed its source beyond themselves. And Nippur sits at the center of that logic. If the me were the powers that made civilization possible, Nippur was one of the places where those powers were understood to be gathered, authorized, and stabilized. The city did not just preserve stories about order, it preserved order as an inherited pattern. That helps explain why its archives mattered so much. The tablets of Nippur were not only literary relics, they were a civilizational memory system. They kept alive the framework that told Mesopotamia where law came from, how kingship became legitimate, why time was structured the way it was, and where sacred authority touched the world. This is why the old language was worth preserving. By the time later dynasties were copying many of these texts, Sumerian was already a learned language, no longer spoken at home or in the marketplace. Yet, students still trained in it. Teachers still corrected it. Priests and scholars still preserved it. That only makes sense if the content carried by the language was believed to matter deeply. A dead language is expensive to maintain. It takes institutional effort. It requires teachers' texts, discipline, and purpose. People do not usually sustain that kind of effort for 3,000 years unless they think they are guarding something essential. And that is exactly what Nippur's scribes seem to have believed. The city's tradition did not have to survive. It was made to survive. And when you look closely, you begin to see three possible ways of understanding why. The first is the standard scholarly interpretation. Nippur preserved this material because the city functioned as the religious and ideological center of Mesopotamian civilization. The texts about divine order, the bond between heaven and earth, and the descent of kingship from heaven helped support a political system in which rulers needed sacred legitimacy. On this reading, the archive is a brilliant and durable expression of theology serving real social and political needs. That interpretation is strong. It explains a great deal. It fits the evidence well. The second interpretation is slightly deeper. In this view, the Nippur texts preserve a kind of political philosophy in sacred language. The Anunnaki assembly reflects real ideas about collective governance. The Tablet of Destinies reflects real ideas about constitutional order and binding law. The ME reflect a deep understanding that civilization depends on structured institutions and inherited capacities. The city's cosmic language is not literal description, but neither is it empty myth. It encodes sophisticated thought about how ordered life works. That interpretation is also persuasive. But then there is the third possibility. What if the scribes of Nippur believed they were preserving memory, not memory in the vague sense of old stories handed down for inspiration, but memory in the stronger sense of transmitted knowledge about beginnings, about a time before ordinary recorded history, about a period when the ordering structures of civilization were first established, and when Nippur, or the sacred reality, later associated with Nippur, stood at the center of that establishment. This is the most speculative reading, and it cannot be proved from the evidence we have. It may be wrong, but it is worth acknowledging because it is the reading closest to the face value meaning of the texts themselves. The texts do not say, "We invented a symbolic story to explain authority." They say kingship descended from heaven. They do not say, "We poetically imagined a center of order." They say Nippur is the bond between heaven and earth. They do not say, "We developed a metaphor for legitimacy." They say destiny is determined there. Modern scholarship is trained understandably to translate those statements into analytical terms. That is part of what scholarship is for. It protects us from reading ancient religion too literally or too carelessly. But something is always lost in that translation. The emotional and intellectual force of the original claim becomes softened, rendered safer, more manageable. And yet the scribes who copied those claims across centuries do not seem to have treated them as soft. They treated them as worth preserving in hard clay. That is a striking fact. Think about the physical reality of it. A scribe sits with wet clay in hand. He presses sign after sign with a reed stylus. He copies a text already ancient in his own day. He does it carefully enough that another person, perhaps centuries later, can read it. Someone bakes or dries the tablet. Someone stores it. Someone else later copies it again when the original cracks or the language grows difficult. Generation after generation, people repeat that process. Why? Not because the text is merely beautiful. There were many beautiful things in the ancient world, not because it is merely entertaining. Administrative schools do not preserve texts for entertainment across millennia. They do it because the material is considered necessary. Necessary for education, necessary for ritual, necessary for continuity, necessary for the structure of the world as they understood it. That is the real force of the Nippur archive. It is not only that the city claimed to be central, it is that thousands of people over enormous spans of time behaved as though that claim had to be remembered. And once you see that, the archive begins to feel different, less like a museum of literature, more like a long-duration message, a civilization writing to the future in the most durable medium it had, insisting that this place mattered, that this order mattered, that this bond mattered, and that forgetting it would mean losing something fundamental about how the world was supposed to hold together. So, perhaps the deepest question is not whether the Sumerians were right in a literal sense. Perhaps the deeper question is what kind of truth they believed they were protecting. Because whether Nippur was a real cosmic center, a sacred political fiction, or a memory transformed by theology, the people who maintained its traditions clearly thought the city carried something too important to vanish. And that brings us to the final and most difficult step in the story. When all the evidence is placed side by side, what are we actually left with? When all the evidence is placed side by side, three broad interpretations emerge. The first is the mainstream historical reading, and it deserves to be taken seriously because it explains a tremendous amount. On this view, Nippur was the sacred center of a civilization that expressed political legitimacy in theological language. The city's claims about being the bond between heaven and earth, the seat of the divine assembly, and the place where destiny was determined were religious expressions of a very real institutional role. Nippur functioned as a neutral, legitimizing center. It mattered because no single dynasty owned it completely, and that made it useful to everyone. Kings could compete with one another for territory, wealth, and military power, but they could all acknowledge the same sacred authority at Nippur without fully surrendering to each other. That interpretation is elegant because it matches what we know about Mesopotamian politics. The theology and the political structure align almost too well. A city without a king of its own becomes the place that validates kings. A city without an empire of its own becomes the city every empire must honor. A sacred center becomes the ideal neutral ground for legitimacy. In that sense, Nippur's language about cosmic centrality may be understood as the religious expression of a political fact. The second interpretation is related but more philosophical. In this reading, the texts of Nippur preserve a deep reflection on what civilization actually requires. The Anunnaki assembly reflects the insight that rule is not merely personal force, but structured governance. The Tablet of Destinies reflects the idea that authority must be grounded in binding order, not arbitrary will. The Emmi express the recognition that cities do not function on instinct alone. They require inherited systems, specialized knowledge, ritual continuity, law administration, and shared frameworks of meaning. In this view, the Sumerians were not recording literal, supernatural events. They were expressing hard-won civilizational wisdom in sacred language because sacred language was the most powerful language they had. This reading also has tremendous strength. It respects the intelligence of the texts without demanding that we flatten them into either raw myth or literal reporting. It allows us to see Nippur as a center of reflection on how order works, how legitimacy is created, how time is regulated, how law becomes binding, and how culture survives across generations. The city becomes not just a religious center, but an intellectual one. And then there is the third interpretation. This is the one most scholars approach with caution, and understandably so. It is the possibility that the texts of Nippur preserve not merely theology or political philosophy, but memory. Not perfect memory, not modern history writing, but a transmitted remembrance of something the Sumerians believed had truly happened in the deep past. A time before ordinary dynastic history, when the ordering structures of civilization were first established and connected to a specific location later known as Nippur. This interpretation cannot be demonstrated the way we can demonstrate the dimensions of a city wall or the date of a tablet fragment. It goes beyond what archaeology can prove, but it remains important for one simple reason. It is the interpretation closest to what the texts themselves say when read without modern softening. The texts say kingship descended from heaven. They say Nippur was the bond between heaven and earth. They say the divine assembly convened there. They say the tablet that governed fate was kept there. They say the city was founded in the middle of the four quarters of the earth. They say that without this center, the structures of civilization would not function. Now, we do not have to accept those statements literally in order to respect them. But we also should not pretend they were casual metaphors to the people who copied them. The scribes of Nippur seem to have treated them as truths of one kind or another. Foundational truths. Truths worth preserving across the death of languages, the collapse of dynasties, and the repeated abandonment and restoration of the city itself. That is where the mystery deepens, because theology usually fades when the institutions supporting it disappear. Political ideologies often weaken when the political order that produced them breaks down. But the core traditions of Nippur did not disappear when their original setting changed. They outlived the Sumerian language as a vernacular. They outlived the city-state system. They outlived the imperial structures that once made its legitimizing function so obvious. And still the texts kept being copied. Why preserve them so stubbornly if they no longer served an immediate practical purpose? That question matters. By the Persian period, the old Mesopotamian world had changed dramatically. The age of competing Sumerian and Babylonian cities was long gone. Nippur's ancient political role was no longer necessary in the same way, and yet the city remained active. The archive tradition persisted. The scribal memory held. That suggests that what was being preserved at Nippur was more than a convenient political tool. It was a claim about reality itself. A claim later generations still felt they could not afford to lose. And perhaps that is the most important point of all. Whether the Nippur texts preserve religion, philosophy, or memory, they preserve seriousness. The seriousness of people who believe civilization rests on inherited order. The seriousness of people who believe legitimacy must come from somewhere higher than force. The seriousness of people who believed some places matter, not because of wealth or military strength, but because they anchor the meaning of the whole system. Nippur is one of the earliest places where human civilization seems to have asked that question in written form. Where does order come from? Why should power be recognized? What makes law binding? Why should time be measured this way and not another? How does a city become more than a place to live and trade? How does it become the center through which the world understands itself? The answer Nippur gives is both simple and difficult. Order comes from above. Legitimacy descends. Civilization is received, maintained, and transmitted. And somewhere in the middle of the plane, there must be a place where that descent becomes visible. For the Sumerians and for the many peoples who inherited their traditions, that place was Nippur. This is why the city remains so compelling even now. Not because we can prove every sacred claim made about it. We cannot. Not because we can confidently resolve whether its traditions were metaphorical or literal. We cannot do that either. But because the city preserves one of humanity's earliest and clearest attempts to place civilization inside a larger order. Nippur forces us to confront a possibility modern people often resist. That the first great urban cultures did not understand themselves primarily as inventors. They understood themselves as custodians, guardians of something given, managers of an order they did not create, but were responsible for preserving. That does not make them less intelligent. In some ways, it may make them more perceptive. They understood that no civilization begins from nothing. Every civilization inherits forms, rules, symbols, tools, and ways of measuring time and authority that feel older than any one generation. The Sumerians expressed that truth through divine language. They spoke of descent, gift, decree, assembly, fate. And at the center of that language stood a city of mud brick and temples, a city of archives and hymns, a city with no king of its own, a city that outlived kings, a city that insisted through 30,000 tablets that the world had a center, and that forgetting that center meant forgetting something essential about civilization itself. That is the claim. And in the next part, we move even closer to the human side of it. Because beyond the theories, the theology, and the cosmic language, there is still a more intimate question waiting beneath all of this. What did it feel like for the people of Nippur to live inside a city that believed it stood at the meeting point between heaven and earth? It is easy when talking about Nippur to get lost in the scale of the claims, the bond between heaven and earth, the seat of Enlil, the assembly of the Anunnaki, the tablet of destinies, the center of the four quarters of the world. These are immense ideas, so immense that they can begin to feel abstract, like concepts floating above ordinary life. But Nippur was not lived as an abstraction. It was a city of streets, walls, canals, courtyards, workrooms, storehouses, temple kitchens, scribal benches, reed roofs, mud brick houses, and people moving through dust and heat. The sacred claims mattered precisely because they were woven into daily life. They were not separate from the city. They were the city's reality, expressed at every level, from the grandest hymn to the smallest administrative tablet. Imagine waking before sunrise in Nippur during one of its great flourishing periods. The air is cooler in those early hours before the day's heat settles across the plain. The temple complex already dominates the skyline. Even from a distance, the raised mass of the sacred precinct announces itself. The Ekur is not simply a building in the city. It is the city's organizing fact. People begin moving early. Laborers, priests, scribes, porters, bakers, herdsmen, administrators, messengers, women carrying goods, temple dependents bringing offerings or supplies. Somewhere nearby, a canal cuts through the urban fabric, carrying water and helping define movement and exchange. Somewhere else, a courtyard fills with the low sound of work beginning. Grain is counted, bread is prepared, deliveries are checked, tablets are impressed and sealed. And over all of this hangs the understanding that Nippur is not just another urban center. The city's practical life unfolds inside a sacred geometry. That is one of the most important things to understand about ancient Mesopotamian religion. It was not confined to occasional moments of worship. It was infrastructural. The gods did not simply receive prayer. They structured the institutions through which life was organized. In Nippur, that structuring role was especially intense because the city's identity rested on the belief that it was the place where the divine order entered the human world in its most concentrated form. So a scribe copying a school text was not merely practicing language. He was participating in the continuity of a sacred archive. A priest reciting a hymn was not merely conducting a ceremony. He was helping maintain the city's place within the order of heaven and earth. A ruler bringing offerings to Enlil was not merely performing public piety. He was submitting himself to the center from which legitimacy flowed. That is what makes Nippur so unusual. Its cosmic claims were lived administratively. Even the most routine tablets from the city reflect this larger pattern. A receipt for grain, a labor list, a contract, a lexical exercise. These may look ordinary to us, and in one sense, they are. But in the world of Nippur, ordinary administration existed inside sacred order. The same scribal culture that copied myths also tracked barley. The same institutions that preserved hymns also preserved inventories. The distance between divine and mundane was shorter there than modern habits of thought often allow us to imagine. And if you lived in that environment, the city's claims about itself would not have felt like wild speculation. They would have felt like the obvious structure of reality that is worth lingering on. Modern people often ask whether ancient societies really believe the things their texts say. But the question can be misleading because it treats belief as if it were merely private opinion. In a city like Nippur, belief was built into the arrangement of public life. It lived in architecture, calendars, school curricula, royal rituals, legal assumptions, and administrative routines. It was not only something you thought, it was something the whole city enacted. To live in Nippur, then, was to live inside a place where cosmic order was local. The center of the world was not somewhere vague or unreachable. It was here, in this temple, on this mound, at this precinct, under the authority of this god. through the memory carried in these tablets. That kind of worldview produces a very particular sense of time. In many modern cities, time feels empty and forward-moving, something scheduled and consumed. In Nippur, time would have felt layered. Ritual calendars tied present action to recurring sacred structures. Ancient hymns tied present worship to primordial events. Royal acknowledgments tied current power to original descent. Scribal copying tied present labor to generations long gone. The past was not dead. It remained active, pressing into the present through text, right, and place. That is why the city could be abandoned and still return. Nippur was not important merely because people lived there at a given moment. It remained important because the place itself held identity across time. The sacred center did not vanish just because buildings collapsed. It waited, buried perhaps, but not erased. And later, generations when they returned did not think of themselves as inventing a new city. They thought of themselves as restoring the old one. That attitude tells us something profound about memory in the ancient world. For Nippur, memory was not passive recollection. It was a duty. You preserved the old texts, not because they were quaint. You rebuilt on the old foundations, not because you lacked imagination. You maintained the old language, not because you were sentimental. You did these things because continuity itself was sacred. The truth of the city lay in its persistence. This is one reason the metaphor of the navel, or central point of connection, becomes so evocative in relation to Nippur. A navel marks a severed link that once sustained life. It is a scar of dependence and origin. In Sumerian thought, the center of the world could be imagined in a similar way. A place where connection to a larger source had once been immediate and where traces of that connection remained. Nippur fits that image almost uncannily well. It is a city built on accumulated layers, the visible form of memory rising above the plain. Every rebuilding phase is literally placed upon what came before. Every generation stands on earlier generations. The city becomes a physical argument for inherited order, and perhaps that is why the clay tablets matter so much emotionally, even now. A cracked tablet from Nippur is not just a text, it is a survival. A human hand pressed signs into wet clay in confidence that someone else would need them later. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not even in the same century, but later. That confidence is astonishing. A person in an ancient scribal room copied a composition about kingship descending from heaven, or the founding of cities, or the role of Enlil, or the determination of destiny, and assumed that preserving those marks was worthwhile. That assumption bridged not only space, but time, far beyond anything the scribe could have imagined clearly. And yet here we are, reading the traces, feeling the pressure of a worldview that insisted order came from elsewhere, descended into history, and had to be guarded with care. That is the human reality inside Nippur's cosmic language. Not only grandeur, but devotion to continuity. Not only theology, but labor. Not only myth, but copying, storing, teaching, rebuilding, and remembering. The city's greatest achievement may not have been that it called itself the center of the world. Its greatest achievement may have been that generation after generation acted as if preserving that claim mattered more than their own immediate moment. That is a very human kind of greatness. And it leaves us with one final question, perhaps the most haunting question of all. If Nippur's scribes were preserving not just stories, but a way of understanding civilization itself, what exactly did they think future generations needed to remember? That may be the deepest question in the whole story. Not whether every claim made about Nippur can be proven in the modern historical sense. Not whether the Anunnaki were symbolic, theological, or something else entirely. not even whether the city was literally what its texts said it was. The deepest question is this: what did the people who copied those tablets believe was too important to lose? Because that is what the archive of Nippur really is. It is a record of selection, a record of choice. Out of everything that could have been written, copied, stored, and carried forward, certain compositions were preserved over and over again. That means someone, or rather many generations of someone's, looked at those texts and decided they had enduring value. And when you step back from the details, a surprisingly clear answer begins to emerge. They were preserving a framework for how civilization understood itself. Again and again, the texts from Nippur circle around the same essential ideas. That order comes from beyond mere human force. That kingship is legitimate only when it is aligned with something higher. That law is not just convenience, but a reflection of a deeper structure. That time itself is not empty, but bound to a sacred pattern. That civilization depends on transmitted capacities, inherited institutions, and the careful maintenance of memory. These are not minor themes, they are foundational. The people of Nippur seem to have believed that if those ideas were forgotten, civilization would still continue in some outward sense. Cities would still rise. Kings would still rule. Markets would still operate. Armies would still march. But something essential would be gone. The inner logic of order would be lost. That may sound abstract, but ancient societies were often very good at noticing something modern societies easily forget. Human communities do not hold together by power alone. They require stories of legitimacy, structures of meaning, and a shared sense that the rules governing life are larger than the appetites of whoever happens to be strongest. Nippur preserved exactly that layer. Its archive was not simply a collection of sacred writings. It was an attempt to keep alive the idea that civilization rests on received order rather than raw improvisation. That is why the city's traditions are so persistent. They are not just local pride or temple propaganda. They are answers to permanent human questions. Where does authority come from? Why should law be obeyed? What makes a ruler more than a conqueror? How do cities remain connected to something larger than trade and survival? How is time itself meant to be structured? What is the source of the knowledge that makes organized life possible? The Sumerians answered those questions in their own language, with their own theology, their own cosmology, and their own institutions. But the questions themselves are permanent. That is one reason Nippur still feels strangely alive when you read the tablets today. The details belong to the ancient world. The structure of the problem does not. And perhaps that is why the archive feels so intentional. A text about the flood preserves not only catastrophe, but the re-establishment of civilization afterward. A hymn to Enlil preserves not only praise, but a theory of how order enters the world. A temple hymn preserves not only sacred geography, but a map of cosmic function. A king list preserves not only dynastic memory, but the claim that rule itself has a source beyond human ambition. A calendar preserves not only dates, but a way of aligning society with a larger pattern. A law code preserves not only penalties and procedures, but the idea that justice descends through legitimate order. Seen together, they form a system of memory. And that system does not merely say, remember Nippur. It says, remember how civilization works. This is where the city becomes more than an archaeological site. It becomes a case study in civilizational self-awareness. Very early in recorded history, the people tied to Nippur grasped that the most important things a culture knows are often not the easiest things to keep. Technical skills can vanish. Languages can die. Rituals can become empty. Political systems can collapse. Archives can burn. If you want something to survive long stretches of time, you have to institutionalize it. You have to teach it, copy it, catalog it, and rebuild the places that hold it. That is exactly what they did. And it is worth noticing how humble the medium was. Clay, not gold, not marble, not bronze monuments built to dominate the eye. Clay tablets small enough to fit in the hand. Marks pressed quietly with a reed stylus, stored in rooms that collapsed, were buried, and waited. There is something fitting about that. The greatest ambition of Nippur was not to dazzle. It was to endure. That may be why the city still feels so different from the monumental self-advertisement of later empires. Nippur did not primarily try to impress the future with size. It tried to speak to the future through continuity. And now, after all these centuries, that continuity reaches us in a fragmented but unmistakable form. A cracked flood tablet, a temple hymn, a city map, a school exercise, a law code, an inventory of literary texts, a ritual composition copied long after its spoken language had vanished. These are not just artifacts, they are acts of trust. Trust that the future would exist. Trust that someone would read. Trust that what had been handed down was worth receiving. So what did the people of Nippur think future generations needed to remember? At the simplest level, they wanted the future to remember that their city mattered. That is clear enough. But beneath that local claim was a larger one. They wanted the future to remember that civilization is not self-explanatory. It has sources, it has structures, it has prerequisites. It depends on legitimacy law, timekeeping transmission, and a sense of connection to something more enduring than temporary power. In their own language, they express that through Enlil, through Duranki, through the Anunnaki, through the me, through the tablet of destinies, through the descent of kingship from heaven. We do not have to translate those things into our own categories too quickly. It may be better to let them remain slightly strange, because in that strangeness, something important survives. A reminder that the earliest civilizations did not imagine themselves as purely human projects. They understood themselves as inheritors and custodians of order. That understanding may not answer every modern question we bring to Nippur, but it does give us a way to read the archive honestly, not as nonsense, not as literal proof of every sacred claim, but as the preserved self-understanding of one of the oldest urban civilizations on Earth. And in that self-understanding, Nippur was not peripheral. It was central, the city where heaven and earth were joined, the city where authority was recognized, the city where fate was decreed, the city where the memory of order was stored in clay, the city that believed forgetting would be a kind of civilizational amnesia. And once you see Nippur that way, the final question is no longer only about the ancient world. It becomes a question for us. What do modern civilizations preserve with that level of seriousness? What do we believe is too important to lose? What are we copying for people we will never meet? What claims about order, legitimacy, truth, and inheritance are we trying to carry forward into futures we cannot see? Nippur does not answer those questions for us, but it places them in our hands. And that may be the most unsettling gift Nippur leaves us with. Not certainty, not a final verdict about whether its sacred claims were literal history, theological symbolism, political philosophy, or some layered combination of all three. What Nippur leaves us with is a standard of seriousness, a standard for what it looks like when a civilization decides that certain truths, or at least certain foundational claims, are too important to be left to chance. That is what 30,000 tablets really represent. Not just information, not just literature, not just religion. Deliberate continuity. A culture taking active responsibility for its own memory. That may be why the city still feels so powerful even now, even in ruins. Because when you strip away the centuries of interpretation, the museum labels the academic debates, the translations, and the theories. What remains is a very human act, repeated over and over again. Someone decided to preserve something for people they would never know. A scribe sat down in Nippur with wet clay and a reed stylus. He copied a hymn, or a king list, or a flood narrative, or a legal text. or a lexical tablet for students, or a record of offerings made at the temple. He did not know the names of the empires that would one day rise and fall over that plain. He did not know that the language he was writing in would one day be dead. He did not know that his city would be buried, excavated, boxed, cataloged, photographed, translated, and read again under fluorescent lights on another continent. He did not know any of that, but he acted as though what he was preserving would matter beyond his own lifetime. And that is the bridge between Nippur and us. Because in the end, the city's greatest claim may not be that it was literally heaven's capital on earth. The city's greatest claim may be that it understood very early and with extraordinary clarity that civilization is made of memory under discipline. Not memory as nostalgia, memory as structure, memory as obligation, memory as the thing that keeps law from becoming mere force, kingship from becoming mere domination, time from becoming empty sequence, and sacred language from dissolving into noise. Because that is what the archive of Nippur feels like when you step back far enough to see it whole. A civilization trying not to forget the terms under which it believed human order was possible. This is why the city refuses to shrink into a single explanation. If you read it purely as religion, something is missing. If you read it purely as politics, something is missing. If you read it purely as myth, something is missing. If you read it purely as historical memory, something is missing. Nippur exists at the intersection of all of these. It is sacred and administrative, poetic, and procedural, symbolic, and practical. It is a place where theology became infrastructure, and where infrastructure preserved theology. It is a city where the language of heaven was used to explain the daily mechanics of law, kingship time, legitimacy, education, and survival. That is what makes it so difficult to dismiss, and perhaps that is also why the city continued to matter long after the world that created it had changed. Because the deeper questions Nippur grappled with never really go away. What gives authority the right to rule? What makes law binding rather than arbitrary? How do human beings distinguish mere power from legitimate order? Where do the structures of civilization come from? Can a culture survive if it forgets the story it tells about its own foundations? The Sumerians answered those questions in terms of Enlil Duranki, the Anunnaki, the me and the descent of kingship from heaven. We answer them differently, or at least we think we do, but the need to answer them has never disappeared. That is why Nippur still speaks, not because its every claim has been historically verified, not because its mysteries have been solved, but because the city preserved the shape of a problem humanity still has. How do you build a world that feels ordered, legitimate, and worth handing on? And how do you preserve that world once you have built it? The people of Nippur gave one answer. You preserve it in clay. You preserve it in ritual. You preserve it in schools. You preserve it in architecture rebuilt on the same foundations. You preserve it in calendars and law, in hymns and lists and maps and administrative habits, in language taught long after it dies in speech. You preserve it not once, but generation after generation, until preservation itself becomes one of the defining acts of the civilization. That is what Nippur did. And maybe that is the final reason the city matters so much. Because among the earliest urban societies on Earth, Nippur seems to have understood that memory is not passive. It is built, maintained, defended, renewed. A city can survive conquest and abandonment if its memory survives. A civilization can outlast its own language if enough people decide that the old words still matter. Nippur is proof of that. Under the mound of Nippur, beneath layers of collapse and rebuilding, the city still holds the compressed remains of thousands of years of human effort to remember rightly. In Philadelphia, London, Istanbul, Baghdad, and elsewhere, tablets from that city still hold the marks of hands long gone. Those marks are small, wedge-shaped, quiet. But they have outlasted palaces, armies, and dynasties. Some things keep very well in clay, and maybe that is the final image to leave with. Not the grandeur of kings, not the thunder of divine assemblies, not even the towering ziggurat rising above the plain, but a tablet, a small object of dried earth, cracked, incomplete, patient. It rests in a tray far from the land where it was made. Its surface still carries signs pressed into it 4,000 years ago by someone who believed those signs were worth the trouble of preserving. On that surface survives a claim that kingship came down from heaven, that destiny could be decreed, that civilization had a center, that Nippur was the place where heaven and earth were bound together. We may never know, in the way modern people often want to know, whether that claim was memory, theology, philosophy, or all three at once. The tablets do not force an answer. They never did. They preserve the claim and leave the burden of meaning to the reader, to the listener, to whoever comes after, and that is us. Wherever you are hearing this, whatever room you are in, whatever country, whatever hour of night or edge of morning, you are now part of the long chain Nippur was written for. Someone there, on that Mesopotamian plain, believed that these ideas had to survive the death of kings, the fall of cities, the silence of buried centuries, and the disappearance of their own language. They believed that one day, someone far beyond their horizon would still need to hear them. So maybe the final question is not whether Nippur was heaven's capital. Maybe the final question is simpler and somehow heavier. What did they understand about order, memory, and civilization that made them work so hard to keep saying the same thing across 3,000 years? The records of Nippur give their answer plainly. This city was the bond between heaven and earth. This was where destiny was determined. This was where legitimacy descended into the world. This was where the structure of civilization was guarded in clay. Whether we call that mythology, wisdom, memory, or faith, the preservation itself is real. The tablets are real. The city was real. The effort was real. And now the question they carried forward rests with us gently and without demand, in the same way clay preserves pressure long after the hand is gone. What is too important for a civilization to forget